So a little insight for you into being a Baptist minister. So the Baptist network, it comprises about 2,000 churches, just a bit under that, 1,800 maybe, and approximately that many ministers as well. And the country is split into different regions. You'll be really glad you're hearing this. It's so fascinating. The country is split into 13 different regions. And we are in the CBA region, which can mean something else as well, but also Central Baptist Association. So we are in the Central Baptist Association, and there are approximately 100 and something churches in that region, so 100 and something ministers as well. And in every region, they will have kind of Baptist ministers meetings as well. And there will be kind of bigger altogether Baptist meetings for the whole region. Then there will be like ones for sub-region, and then there'll be even smaller ones for a smaller area as well. Lots of meetings, that's what we do well as Baptists. But there is Baptist clusters that will take place that will maybe be a smaller group of people, maybe 5 to 10 people, and they will be ministers in the area. And I've been a minister in 3 different Baptist regions. I'm not going to say which region I'm talking about now, but in one of those regions in the Baptist cluster that I have been part of, there was a Baptist minister that I would see regularly every month, along with the other Baptist ministers there. And you'd basically meet together on a roughly monthly basis, and you would share together, you would talk about all your woes of church life, all the joys, and you would pray together and support one another. And in one of the clusters that I've been part of, there was a Baptist minister who, he was just very, very quiet in these meetings. And he kind of just came across as quite, to me anyway, he kind of just got on with the job, but maybe didn't have loads going on in his life necessarily, just quietly getting on with it. And he didn't generally have loads to say. So I probably just made my subconscious assumptions about him as a person, and maybe how he was as a minister as well. But then also, like I said, a few times a year, there are these bigger gatherings of ministers across a region. And often when these gatherings take place, ministers can tell a regional minister if they would like to share a particular topic that they've been exploring or reflecting on more recently. And in that kind of gathered minister's time, that minister might kind of give a bit of a presentation and then a bit of a Q&A time and a chance for people to respond to that. And in an email about this upcoming regional ministers meeting, I see that this minister, who's been part of my Baptist clusters and been very, very quiet, is going to be sharing something in that he put forward something that he would share. So I was quite surprised that he was even sharing anything at all. And then I was even more surprised when I found out what he was sharing about, which was about Baptist civil disobedience. And he basically gave this presentation talking about a number of Baptist ministers over the years over the past 100 years, who have taken part in acts of civil disobedience, where they stood up against different laws that they've really passionately disagreed with, and sometimes face the consequences of that as well. So I was already quite engaged at this point as he was sharing about this. And then he gives this double-sided handout to each of us in the room, where it has 3 stories of current Baptist ministers who are happy to share about their stories of taking part in acts of civil disobedience for us to just read quietly. So I read the first 2 on the first page, and they're really interesting to read. And I'd heard of one of the Baptist ministers before and not one of the other ones. And then I turned the page to the 3rd one, and you can maybe guess who this person was. It was this very Baptist minister, the one who I just thought really quietly got on with his job, didn't get up to too much beyond that, really. And he was sharing about how he had taken part in multiple different protests, different marches, different campaigns, that had got really close to being arrested before as well. Essentially, in that time, he just completely reframed my view of this person. I realized that I'd actually kind of been putting him in a bit of a box. And I was really quite humbled. It made me really ask the question of how do I draw assumptions about people sometimes? And at this minister's cluster meeting, at the minister's cluster meetings that we had after this one, I definitely viewed this guy in a different light. I was suddenly a lot more interested to kind of draw from him what other things that he had been engaged with. But I wonder if any of you ever had that experience, probably not a Baptist clusters meeting, but where you think you've maybe got someone down to a T, where you think you know all there is to know about that person. But then suddenly you've learned something new about them, about their past. You've gained a fuller picture of who they are. You've realized there are actually a lot more layers to that person than you first assumed. Maybe you realize that you got that person really quite wrong. This story that Philippa just shared shows how Peter thought he had Jesus down to a T, thought he knew exactly what he was about. And even when Jesus says something different to what Peter thought Jesus was about, he's like, no, that's not right. That's not who you are. You're this. And Peter is about to get very, very challenged in his understanding on that matter. So just before we get to that, just to backtrack for a moment, the previous story that is in Mark leads straight into this passage. So last week, wave if you were here last week for our all-age service in our AGM, we talked about where Jesus says to his disciples, who do people say that I am? And there were responses of, well, some people say you're John the Baptist. Some people say you're Elijah. And then Jesus asked, well, who do you say that I am? And then Peter responds saying, you're the Messiah. Bingo. Peter has got it right. Peter gets extra brownie points for that answer. He must have been chuffed with himself, a gold star there for Peter. He said the right answer. You are the Messiah. So then now we get to this story where it follows straight on from the previous one. Jesus is basically responding to Peter's assertion that he is the Messiah. Jesus is basically saying here, well, let me tell you something about the kind of Messiah that I'm going to be. The Son of Man is going to undergo suffering and rejection and be killed, and after the third day rise again. And Peter takes Jesus to one side and responds saying basically, wait a second. I just said that you were the Christ, the Messiah, but that's not what I meant. Suffering is not what I meant. And Jesus rebukes this in a really strong response. And you've got to feel for Peter here. He's probably only saying what the other disciples are thinking. It's just that he has the guts to actually say it, and maybe what many other followers were thinking as well. Peter must be wondering where he got it, where he went so wrong. I just got the star question right, and now I'm in trouble. What happened there? I'm only telling Jesus who the Messiah is really supposed to be. But that's the trouble here. The trouble is that this is the belief that they inherited, the belief that Peter inherited, the belief that he inherited there, that the Messiah was supposed to be coming with strength and power and might and to crush the opposition. That was the Jewish belief that he had inherited of what the Messiah was. And we all inherit different beliefs ourselves about everything, and Christianity is no exception. Some of us may have grown up in the Christian faith. We might have inherited the beliefs of our parents. Some of us may have been introduced to faith through Alpha or through other courses. or through the church that we first chose to become a part of. Maybe that was 5 years ago, 10, 20, 40 plus years ago. And that is great. That's brilliant. However, the Christian faith is broad. There is often more than one single way of understanding something about our faith. Over time, through asking questions of the Bible in relation to the world around us, Christians have humbly come to new conclusions on what or how God calls us to believe or to live or to act in this world. Less than 200 years ago, slavery was still perfectly legal. Many Christians really supported slavery. They used the Bible to argue about why it was right. But then through the brave work of William Wilberforce and others, he expressed that God is against slavery, and they helped to get slavery abolished. If you or I were a Christian 200 years ago, I wonder what you would have believed. Would you have believed the faith that you inherited? Most likely that it was perfectly acceptable and right even to have slaves, and that God was actually endorsing of this. I wonder if we would have believed that too, as the faith we inherited. 100 years ago, most Christians believed that women should not be in leadership, and certainly shouldn't be Baptist ministers. And sadly today, there are still some Christians who do believe that. But thankfully, that is now more a minority. And more women are becoming ministers. Many of you were around here when Dawn was a minister here. I wonder what you would have believed 100 years ago. Would you believe the same that you do today about women in leadership? Or would you perhaps believe the faith that you inherited? So going back to Peter, poor Peter, simply asserting the belief that he had inherited, that the Messiah would come and overthrow the oppressive rulers with great power, might, and violence. That Jesus challenges this belief. He shows Peter and his disciples another way. It takes Peter a long time for this to truly sink in. And he still ends up denying Jesus 3 times. But in time, Peter gets it. And it becomes one of the key founders of the Christian church and one of Jesus' most ardent and faithful followers. So I wonder for us, rather than allowing God, Jesus, the Bible, to shape our faith, are there times where we've tried to make our faith suit our own inherited beliefs? What faith beliefs have we inherited that Jesus is trying to gently challenge us and to show us another way? On to the next part. But turning and looking at his disciples, Jesus rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind on divine things, but not on divine things, but on human things." So this is a really strong rebuke from Jesus. Get behind me, Satan. Imagine hearing those words directed at you from Jesus. Theologian Ched Myers says, the problem here is that Peter remains loyal to the traditional messianic script that affirms the myth of redemptive violence, in which the hero prevails over the enemy through superior and righteous force. And with this, the oldest lie, Satan rules history. As nations and peoples invoke God while they try to destroy their enemies through just wars and crusades. Against this is pitted the Jesus strategy of non-violence, which understands the enemy is violence itself. So in other words, what Ched Myers is saying here is that Peter is seriously misinterpreting what God is really about. Jesus challenges people in different ways. Sometimes he'll give a strong rebuke, like with Peter. Other times he'll gently question people. And then other times in the Gospels, when someone asks a question or says something that isn't right, isn't helpful, he will instead tell them a story, tell them a parable, show them a different way. But Jesus saves his strongest rebukes for those who are using God for their own agendas. For Peter wanting a warrior Messiah, setting his mind on human things and not divine things. The money changers in the temple when Jesus throws over the tables, where they're using a place of God to bring oppression to people. Or when the teachers of the law are telling Jesus that he should not heal someone on the Sabbath. These are the times where Jesus most strongly responds to them and rebukes them. So I wonder for us here, are the ways that we are trying or have tried to use God for our own agendas? Something to ponder. And finally, we get to this section where Jesus called the crowd and his disciples and said to them, if any wish to come after me, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? So you might have noticed as you came to sit down this morning, a little cross on your seat. If you didn't, maybe a little annoying lump as you went to come and sit down. I'd like you to just take hold of that cross. Hopefully you've got one by you. If not, there'll be one in the seats in front of you, just to take hold of that little wooden cross. And just keep hold of it for the final chunk of this time. So in this final part of the passage, we've had Jesus tell his disciples what he must endure as the Messiah, as the Son of God. We know what he says will happen, does actually happen. That he will allow himself to be judged and condemned as a blasphemer by by Jewish religious leaders. That he'll allow himself to be mocked, tortured, executed as a criminal by the Romans. And that's not all. Jesus actually expects his disciples to follow him on this path of suffering and death. Here, I think it's really important to be clear about what Jesus means by taking up the cross. He's not talking about the suffering that is simply part of life in a broken world. Everything from annoying neighbors to serious illnesses to natural disasters. Neither is he telling us to seek out suffering or martyrdom. Jesus himself did not seek it, but he foresaw that it would become an inevitable outcome of his mission. Jesus speaks of losing our lives for his sake and for the sake of the gospel. Taking up our cross means being willing to suffer the consequences of following Jesus faithfully, whatever those consequences might be. It means putting Jesus's priorities and purposes ahead of our own comfort and security. It means being willing to lose our lives by spending them for others, using our time, resources, gifts, and energy so that others might experience God's love made known in Jesus. How can we possibly do this? Our instinct for self-preservation fights it at every step. In this sense, we're no different from the first disciples. They certainly tried to save their lives. Though Jesus tried to prepare them for what was to come in Jerusalem, they all deserted him. And Peter, poor Peter, the star student who had the right answer. He not only ran away, but he denied 3 times that he ever even knew the man called Jesus. We might wish that things had happened differently, that Jesus had followed a more dignified, Messiah-like path, and that his disciples had been more heroic. But this is not the story we have before us. What we have before us is a story about a Messiah being tortured and killed by the powerful and abandoned by his closest companions. Yet Mark has announced from the beginning that this story is good news. How can this be? Well, we need to read the whole story to be sure, because the whole story tells us that Jesus was faithful unto death, even while all around him proved faithless, and that God raised him to new life. Because of this, we know that the answer to the world's problems is not through more war, violence, and oppressive rule. We know that there is a higher, more Christ-like way to live and to show God's sacrificial love. Because of this, we know that God's life-giving power is far stronger than the worst that human hands can do. Because of this, we know that there is no sin or failure so great that it can finally separate us from the love of God in Christ. So a final question, a simple but challenging question in light of all of this. Are we prepared to take up our cross and to follow him? Let's pray. Loving God, we thank you that you came to earth. Emmanuel, God with us. Through Christ you came and you showed us a way to a greater way of living. A way that wasn't of human beings. A way that wasn't through oppression, through might, through power. A way that was through love, through gentleness, through humble service, through servanthood, through turning the other cheek, through showing people grace and love. Lord, there might be things in our lives, in our faith journeys, that we have got wrong. Ways that we are so sure are right. But Lord, you know that they are not your ways. Lord, in Isaiah, you tell us that your ways are higher than our ways. And I pray that we will be reminded of that today and in days and weeks and months and years ahead. That your ways are higher than our ways. Lord, may we be humble. May we be humble in our approach to you and our approach to others. May we recognize the layers of our faith, the layers of other people, the layers of you. Lord, may we come to you humbly, knowing that we don't have all the right answers. Lord, may we, when we share our faith with others, also remember that we don't have the right answers. But what we do know is that you love us and you love the people that we are engaging with. May we simply be mirrors of that love, Lord. May we help show other people that there is a better way to live. The way of your kingdom, the way that leads to life in all its fullness, the way that leads to a more beautiful, perfect life to come. Lord, lead us in that way. May we take up our cross daily and commit ourselves to following you. In your name.